Sure. Thank you for having me here, and apologies for not speaking Serbian. Is someone going to translate, or no? Well, hopefully you'll be able to understand me, everyone. I will speak as slowly as I can. So I myself was a school teacher, a primary school teacher, so 11 years old and younger, and I was living in Birmingham, in the Midlands in the UK, in England, and I was always on the left politically, and I would go to demonstrations or marches. I sometimes took part in some direct action activities, but I wasn't immersed within a left-wing political culture. And I felt that mainstream politics was something that was disengaging, disempowering, and a type of politics that didn't represent me and my values, or the transformation that was needed in society. I then volunteered on the campaign to elect Jeremy as leader of the Labour Party, because I'd finished teaching, so it was the end of the school year, and I'd left my job as a teacher, and my plan was actually to go and live in Barcelona and teach English as a foreign language, but to have some time to think, read, reflect, and think of what I wanted to do in my life, because I was very disillusioned by the state of the education system and how I felt children were put under immense pressure to achieve academic targets that was just like a factory, and teachers were under incredible pressure to constantly perform to their manager and the head teacher and the school inspectors, and the whole thing had become dehumanized. So when I then saw Džeremija Korbina was running to be leader of the Labour Party, I felt very inspired. I knew him because I grew up in a neighbouring constituency, and he would often speak at events and rallies, and he would support everyone in the local community, the greengrocer, old lady at the bus stop, someone who needed support with immigration. He always had the time and care. And he also had the policy platform and the political analysis that I really rated. So I went back and volunteered on that campaign in the summer of 2015. And it was an amazing sense of community activism, of people coming together all day from 10 in the morning until 8 in the evening, 7 days a week. On the weekends the hours were a bit shorter, in this big trade union building which had been given up during the summer for free. And people were making phone calls to Labour Party members and supporters and affiliated Labour Party members through trade unions all day to encourage them to vote for Džeremija Korbina. And the range of people was elderly people, students, people who were at work who would just come in their lunch break, but there was a sense of community, putting something in, real sense of like harmony, cohesion in the atmosphere, and everyone making each other tea and coffee. And we had these scripts that we would read to encourage people, to persuade people to vote for Džeremija Korbina if they didn't yet know. And it was during that summer, making those phone calls, that I realised that there was a high chance he was going to win, because people just kept saying they were going to vote for him. And you think maybe they're lying to get you off the phone, but they weren't, because they were talking about why. And then it was off the back of that campaign. During that campaign, I organised an arts policy launch for Džeremija. So it was he was launching a sort of manifesto for the arts, music, theatre, dance, a general sort of arts policy. And I organised the event with someone else, which we made much more engaging. So we had live music, and we had some poetry and a comedian, because we were given a whole week to organise, and everyone else on the campaign was rushed every day the next event. So because the event went quite well, Džeremija and John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, in his sort of number two, as it were, or his companion, they asked myself and this other person, Emma, if we would be involved in discussions to then set up a movement organisation growing out of that campaign. But it's because it was so small at the time, because Džeremija was a complete outsider, So there wasn't a big operation, and even though there were volunteers, if you were seen to be sort of regularly turning up and then competent organising an event, you were in the room. And that's how myself, Emma, and then 2 other people ended up establishing Momentum that grew out of that campaign. It was a successor to the 2015 campaign to elect Jeremy.
Okay, so coming to Momentum. Today I shared on a Facebook event an article from BBC from 2015, and in this article this journalist is saying like, okay, they're talking about Momentum as Jeremy Corbyn's secret weapon. So can you tell us what Momentum actually is, because it is supporting Jeremy Corbyn, it is supporting Labour Party and Transformation Labour Party, but it is outside of the Labour Party. So can you just explain to people what Momentum actually is and what is the purpose, what is the goal?
Sure. So Momentum was initially founded about 4 weeks after Jeremy was elected as leader of the Labour Party, and the initial aim was to build on that energy and enthusiasm from that summer insurgency campaign, and to try and build on that in order to do 3 things, and that was to transform the Labour Party, to move it to the left, but to do so through mass participation, through more dynamic ways of organising, through bringing new people into politics. So that's number 1, transforming Labour. Number 2, winning an election for Labour, a general election. So that was pioneering new campaigning techniques and thinking of ways to use the enthusiasm and to enable the new activists into actually doing things at scale and for winning. And the third thing was to build to work with existing groups and movements and to build a social movement in UK society around this sort of political platform, this project. But it was very vague in the initial days because we had to launch like that without we had no governance structure at the time. We didn't have a membership scheme. We didn't have any office space. We had no office space for months. We had no infrastructure. We didn't really have a strategic plan other than a sort of shared set of ideas that Jeremy needs this. He became leader of the Labour Party, but the vast majority of members of Parliament at the time were very, very hostile to him. So there was a need for something to show that there was mass support for Jeremy, because it wasn't obvious in the Labour Party, in the parliamentary party, but even all these new members had never gone to a local meeting before. And then they turn up at a meeting and often, sadly, people were quite rude and unwelcoming and assumed that everyone was a bunch of thugs. There was a coordinated campaign in the British media and amongst a number of members of Parliament to demonise Momentum and make out that it was thuggish, cultish, a Trotskyite sect. There was an organisation called Militant in the 1980s that had infiltrated the Labour Party, and they were trying to suggest it was the same thing. So we were constantly being attacked, but then that made us more determined to not get small and closed and sort of secretive and inward-looking and untrusting, but to be constantly trying to build and scale and bring new people in and build an inclusive culture, because it's a lot harder to attack a mass popular movement. So those are the early steps. I can't remember what your exact question was, but talk to how did it establish what? Yeah.
But you managed in the end to mobilize a lot of people. So as I understand, you managed to include people who were not politically active, they were not activists, so you managed to kind of activate a lot of people. So maybe you can tell us about something about that.
That's funny you use the word activate, because the Conservative Party, the right-wing governing party in the UK, they tried to build a momentum, their own momentum, and they called it activate. I mean, nothing ever happened with it, but that word always makes me laugh. But yeah, so the idea was to bring new people into politics and to help people organise in their campaign, in their communities and their workplaces on issues which mattered to them. And in the beginning that was sort of rhetoric, but our messaging was quite different from maybe that traditional left organisation, and certainly from the Labour Party, which was much more seeing members. The Labour Party, certainly under Tony Blair, had seen members as a nuisance, sort of at worst a nuisance, and at best people that were, you know, fodder to go out on the doorstep and put leaflets through doors on a rainy Sunday morning, or Saturday morning more likely. But so we tried to change that approach, and we did that. But I mean, for me, I had a sort of barometer, like a test, which was if my friends, so a lot of my close friends from a working class background, left school at 16 or 17, but they're quite politically, they're, you know, socially progressive, and they lean towards the left. I'd say they're left wing, but they don't necessarily have like a deep political analysis, and they don't mix in political circles. But I would always think if this event is something that my friends would want to take part in and want to get involved in, then it's a good idea, and if not, then it's not a great idea. Obviously, that's not a foolproof test, and there's cultural specificities to that. You know, I'm talking about a group of people of a certain age in London, but that sort of approach, which I think a lot of us who were there at the beginning had, which was how can we ensure that we're open, inclusive, or how can we ensure that people come to our events and they leave feeling energized, so they leave feeling a sense of like activated, but leave feeling a desire to go out and do something, but feeling hopeful and feeling, yeah, engaged, having energy, rather than sort of, you know, ending up feeling drained and tired or demoralized about the state of the world. So that was an approach we had. I mean, we also had the fact that I think the political climate was ripe for a new politics, and Džeremija Korbina himself as a candidate was such an anti-politician in so many ways that he didn't play the game. He wasn't just all, you know, spin and stuff. He was clearly a person of integrity and authenticity, and not just sort of like Tony Blair or David Cameron or a lot of these slick politicians in the UK. So that helped too.
And maybe you can tell us, like, also to kind of to explain more what Momentum is. Maybe you can tell us like something about your activities. What were your campaign? What was actually that you were doing? So
it's interesting that I think Momentum's greatest strength, and there's definitely a lot of weaknesses and mistakes we made along the way, a huge number as well, because when you're born so suddenly, when an organisation is birthed in chaos, in crisis, there's strengths and weaknesses. But a real strength of that was an ability to be very dynamic, to be very nimble, agile, not to have bureaucratic processes taking forever to take decisions, or analysing things to the nth degree, you know, forever and ever. We were much more able to just act. So our initial campaign when we launched, which at the time really, to be honest, myself and 2 or 3 other people just decided on, with Owen Jones, who's a well-known journalist and activist in the UK. He was sort of advising us in those early stages of some things he thought would work, what were a good idea to launch with. But the first campaign we had was called Democracy SOS, and that was meant to be a bit more direct action inspired, but it was basically leafleting all around the country to let people know that about changes to the electoral register, because the Conservative government were planning to change the law, meaning that 1.2 million people were going to drop off the electoral register, because previously one member of a household could register everyone else who lived there. But these changes were intended to make sure that each individual person had to register themselves, and that was overwhelmingly affect poorer people, students, immigrant communities, generally people who were much more likely to vote Labour than Conservative. So we chose this campaign because it was not hostile. We were being accused of being thugs or, you know, anarchists, Trotskyists, one thing after the other, but we wanted to show that it was a relatable campaign, that people could, you know, connected with people in society, and it was pretty soft. It was hard to attack the idea that everyone should have the ability to vote. So that was our initial campaign, and we then had a social media campaign, there was no harm done, but we had this notion that we could get viral videos opposing the George Osborne, who was then the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Conservative. We made these videos, and they were going to introduce cuts to working tax credits, and we made these videos opposing it, but we thought it would go viral if people emailed in the link. But in reality, we only had about 3 or 4 people sent in videos, but we collected, we made loads. Everywhere I went, I'd sort of say, oh, would you mind if I film you? So we'd film people all around the country in different settings, different ages and demographics. But in truth, that was mostly done by me, actually, yeah, and a couple of other people. But that was enough to give the impression, but it just didn't catch on, it didn't scale. Whereas the next campaign was when the UK was going to bomb in Syria in December 2015. And that was the first time that Momentum really showed its strength and its organisational force, its capacity, by creating a very simple tool where people could lobby their MPs, encouraging them not to vote with the Conservative government. David Cameron was Prime Minister at the time, to bomb in Syria. And we had, I think, 25,000 emails were sent in 24 hours, something like that. But it was then that everyone was like, okay, Momentum can do stuff. Like, Momentum is actually a force. It's able to mobilise people and it's able to make a difference. And in that case, it was annoying a lot of MPs because they were getting so many messages in their inbox. So those are the first 3 campaigns, which were really, the first one we came up with, Democracy SOS. The next one, again, we came up with and it wasn't a success. I mean, it was fine. I think it looked good, it was good for messaging, but it didn't catch on. So I think you have to be more reactive to what emerges from the bottom up, rather than a sort of clever idea from the top down. And then the third one was responding to the needs of the moment with the Syria vote. But then we had to build our structures. So we had no real democratic structures for the first few months. Organisation, you know, we were operating with this sort of goodwill. There was so much goodwill and there was so much hope and optimism. And all these people were setting up groups all around the country. So much activity was also going on in a local level, with people setting up campaign initiatives or film screenings or different types of talks. Or the People's PPE was an initiative that came out of a group in East London, and that's politics, philosophy and economics is a very elite degree you can do, university degree you can do in the UK at Oxford and Cambridge and other universities. But the idea of the People's PPE was just a conversation like this, maybe 3 or 4 people discussing political, economic, philosophical issues, but in an accessible format and in huge spaces like the East London Mosque. It's in a very Muslim area of East London, and over 1,000 people came to that first event. And as a national organisation, we supported it by sending out emails and turning up and bringing journalists, because it was still early days. But then we were a little bit running the risk of stagnating because it wasn't clear what we were doing, and we were focusing inward on building our structures and infighting. But before that became a problem, and also launching membership, we had all this infrastructure, organisation stuff we had to focus our energy on. And there was only 3 staff members at the time, and we were all paid, you know, a low amount of money. It was me and 2 other people. So we didn't have the capacity to do what we needed to be doing on a bigger scale. But we'd have at least 10, sometimes up to like 40 or 50 volunteers in the London office. So a lot of the work was done by volunteers, which has its downsides, but has huge positives. And I think building a culture of things seeming fun and accessible and engaging, lots of young people were involved. So we did have a daily office culture. And then that also encouraging groups to do a lot of work themselves. But then it was the campaign after the Brexit vote, when a number of MPs resigned every hour, on the hour, to try to topple Džeremija, to try and force him to resign. It was that moment, it was the moment when it was so clear and so sort of undemocratic and so manipulated how that was done, that led to a huge surge in our membership, and that was when Momentum really took off, when we had the campaign to re-elect Džeremija. So yeah, campaigns, Momentum did very well in general elections.
Yeah. That's in 2016 when he was.
Summer of 2016. Yeah.
But also, I mean, Momentum also influenced a lot on Labour campaign and general elections, where Labour got 10% more than on the previous elections. And that's where you managed to somehow show to people that Džeremija Korbin's idea is something that people, you know, can vote for, and not the people can, but a lot of people can vote for. And you still are struggling for transforming Labour Party. So there are still like a lot of people inside of Labour Party that are opposing Džeremija Korbin. And from our perspective, from my perspective, for example, a couple of years ago, I couldn't believe that Labour Party could transform from some kind of Blairite third way party to something that can be, let's say, more left-wing or radical left-wing party. So maybe you can tell us something about current situation in Labour Party and what is going on and what is the struggle inside of the party.
That's a really good question, and it fits with the timeline as well, because it was the first year we were encouraging people to join the Labour Party, but many people did. They got involved and they were active and they organised, and it was great. But in many cases, people didn't really understand how the Labour Party worked. So we always had some members who were in the Labour Party all the years and remained in there throughout the Blair era. We had some, like, you know, the old left that remained in Labour since the 80s was a contingent. There were also a lot of the Corbyn movement is actually people who were maybe more the politics of like the soft left, or more like Ed Miliband's politics, who were won over by Džeremija and who stayed. And I think that's important that there's that coalition too. But the vast majority were new people who were like disengaged by mainstream politics and disengaged by the Labour Party, and then they came in and got involved. But in order to ask, if you ask people to do something exciting or engaging, it's much easier. But if you say, can you sit through a really long, boring meeting with motions and you know, endless debates around structure or process, it's off-putting. But we were quite lucky that the attempt to get rid of Džeremija was such a stitch-up by the establishment of the Labour Party that it was so obviously unjust that it politicised people rapidly, and it made people's attention focus on the Labour Party. So the summer 2015, to vote Džeremija Korbin, to vote in the leadership election, there were 4 candidates at the time. Džeremija was one. You had to either be a Labour Party member, or you could pay £3 to join, as long as you weren't a member of another political party and you said that you supported the aims and values of the Labour Party. And Džeremija got 60% of the vote, even though there were 3 other candidates, and the sort of Blairite candidate got 4% of the vote. So that showed, and that was amongst every breakdown. So the members, the registered supporters who paid £3, and the affiliated supporters through trade unions. But the second, in 2016, they tried to get rid of him. They tried to force him to resign, and by they, I mean a number of members of his shadow cabinet, so his team, who weren't necessarily politically aligned to him, but they filled some of the top jobs. They all resigned every hour, on the hour, with the media cycle, to really create this sense that it was untenable for him to carry on. But when he stayed, when he stuck through that, and it was clear how much support there was, momentum, we actually organised in 24 hours. 10,000 people got into Parliament Square for this rally that was called Keep Corbyn, Build Our Movement. But the messaging was very much saying it wasn't all about him, and even if he did go, which he didn't, but we were trying to make it clear it wasn't just about him as an individual, but it was about building a movement across society and not letting this moment be stolen. And him staying was essential to that at that time. So yeah, we had that rally. Then people kept resigning, but then the Labour Party's elected body, so not MPs, but the national executive of the party, the National Executive Committee, introduced these new rules where you then had to pay £25 to be a registered supporter instead of £3. So it was so obviously unjust and pricing people out of voting. And also they said that historically Labour Party members could always vote in leadership elections, but they also introduced a rule that you had to have joined 6 months before. So even though that meant many Labour Party members could still vote, because a lot of new members joined in the September or during the summer before that when Džeremija became leader. But if you joined in the January or after, you couldn't vote, and there weren't many people who had done that. So that was so obviously unjust that it enabled us to focus energy on we've got to transform the Labour Party. We wouldn't use language like take over, we use language like transform. And that has happened. Now the General Secretary, the most senior staff position in the Labour Party, is on the left. And there's a left majority on the National Executive Committee, and many constituency parties around the country, the left is becoming more, is in a leadership position. And we've got the leadership, Džeremija himself. So there is an effective move, but I think always it was talking in a language that's broad and inclusive, not letting ourselves be pigeonholed. Like if people who want to attack us, they'll try and put you in a box, and then they'll shoot you for being in the box. But if you don't go in the box in the first place, it's harder for them to attack you, even if you know that the frame is completely unfair or an exaggeration or a distortion. It's better to find a way to not play their game, and I think largely we've been able to do that in order to grow.
Yeah, and as I read lately, some of these anti-Corbyn Labour members are saying that they are being censored, something that there is censorship. That if you are saying something against Corbyn, that you are basically being censored by Corbyn. So it's also like some kind of campaign that it's Corbyn who's not democratic, but
I mean, the attacks have varied like hugely, but the main attack was Džeremija is unelectable. Lovely ideas, but unelectable. And then, obviously, when there was then the general election called in April 2017, a 6-week or 7-week campaign up until June 2017, Labour's share of the vote rose from 30% 2 years earlier, in May 2015, to 40% in June 2017. So that is an extraordinary rise, given the fact that there was daily attacks in the media, constant negativity. There was the internal leadership challenge halfway through those 2 years. So that was a major thing that was proven just not true. And then you get all sorts of other, it's not to say there's not, in all criticism there might be an element of something reasonable within it, but so often it's just to find a way to undermine the project. Not everyone, I mean, some people genuinely believe their criticisms. I'm not trying to sort of see it as like a conspiracy, like everyone, us and them, but it just ranges hugely from Corbyn's authoritarian to he's too soft on people, to, he's unelectable, he's not a leader, every accusation kind of vary, or momentum of thugs, they're aggressive, it's old people, or it's all young people, they're young, naive students or activists, or they're all old, aggressive trot. It just varies hugely depending on, depending on what seems like it will cut through. So I think the best way to respond to that is proving that you don't have that sort of mentality or approach.
Okay, maybe we can stop for now here and then open the floor for questions. So if there are any questions.
I think it's the dynamic between what is essentially a citizens movement and a party in very strict political terms. I find that quite fascinating. And I think you talked a little bit about it, how people didn't see, well, you coming from Momentum, that's not a party, but at the same time it was very closely tied to a political party. And I think, I don't know if you'll agree, but that this, being able to recognize that there will be a political impact through an established political actor, as is the party, especially in a two-party system, was one of the crucial things that led people to the movement itself, because there are a lot of political citizens movements, but they rarely get this kind of support that Momentum did. And I wonder if it was the correlation between actually political establishment in its most strict form and something different
that's an interesting question. Do you want to do more questions or? That's a really interesting question, and it's complicated. It's down to our electoral system. I think if Britain didn't have a first past the post electoral system, you probably wouldn't see such a broad coalition in one party, or even of the left. So even the even of the left, of the Corbyn supporting left, there's a whole range from like trade unions to like the old left within Labour to extra parliamentary activist organisations like Stop the War Coalition and People's Assemblies, like those type of things, to more sort of anarchisty leaning direct action type groups. And then I think the biggest group within that is people new to politics, which is like the vast majority in terms of numbers. But it has been an interesting challenge having that all under one umbrella. But I think also, if it's more about action, like what you do, it enables people to not be put off, to not come to something and then feel disillusioned. So in the general election, for example, if the choice was between Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn, Conservatives and Labour, what Momentum did is we just created some simple digital tools. There was nothing genius about how they were built. But for example, there was mynearestmarginal.com. So people canvass in constituencies, different constituencies around the country. Some of them were very strongly Labour or very strongly Conservative. But in the ones where it was winnable, it was seen as close. Labour either had a close lead from the previous election, or the Conservatives were in, but it was only with a small majority. We created this digital tool where you typed in your postcode, your home address, and it would tell you your nearest marginal constituency, and when the campaigning sessions were on, what date and time, etc. So it was a way of, you didn't have to find complete consensus around every policy idea or all these specificities. You just had to have a sense, I believe in this, and I want to go out and do something. And that mobilised tens of thousands of people that took part in that app during the election. And similarly, in the general election, we had a website, electiondaypledge.co.uk, and it was just a very simple web page where you could sign up to pledge to take the day off work on election day, if you could, if you had a job where you could do that. And then that meant that over 10,000 people signed up through Momentum's website, and we calculated that would have knocked on 1.2 million doors. So it's actually doing things that have a real sizable impact, but don't necessarily involve, if you try and find the difference within a coalition as broad as the Corbyn coalition, it's complicated. So I know that's partly answered your question, sort of talk about something else.
Well, okay, we can move on to the next question. Take up the next question.
Just to follow up on that, on what you said, because I actually moved back to Serbia 2 weeks before that general election. So one of my housemates in London at the time was doing the Find My Nearest Marginal. But he was quite put off because one of the nearest marginal was actually an MP, a Labour MP, who was anti-Corbyn and we didn't really support. He did go out and campaign in the end. But did you get a sense at that time of any animosity? Was there any sort of unwritten or unspoken sort of words going around Momentum about who you should and shouldn't support? Or were you purely loyal to the Labour Party? And did you feel that there might have been some tensions either from outside or from within? That's
a really good question, and I think we absolutely said we campaign in every constituency, and I can understand why people on an individual level might feel compromised, but the whole debate around buying into that narrative that we're going to lose badly, some people are saying we're going to lose badly across the board in Labour, like the left of Labour and the right of Labour thought, because it was being said in the media, the polls were incredibly low. Labour were polling at 24% when the election was called, and then 7 weeks later got over 40% of the vote. But we very much in Momentum had an approach that we're going to try and win this. We're going to try and win the general election, which a lot of people thought was delirious optimism. And we're going to campaign in every constituency, or certainly every winnable constituency. And we're not going to start making decisions or calculations like that. And some people at the time, including on the left, were kind of negative and were saying, well, you're going to end up with you're going to end up keeping some MPs who are hostile to Corbyn in. But I think that would have been a very defeatist mentality. Also, it's exactly what the media and many people opposed to Džeremija within the Labour Party would have, you know, capitalised on. So to say and to mean that we're going to campaign everywhere, meant, which you need to have a Labour government, meant that, you know, we did. And yeah, many MPs who were hostile to Džeremija were re-elected. They are the choice was them or Conservatives, or maybe Lib Dems, so you do need that. You know, there's separate work Momentum does around selections of candidates, but given the candidates were who they were, it was absolutely campaign for everyone. And that has changed, and that's many people that's really changed their view. I mean, there are some MPs who are just hostile to Džeremija Korbin, full stop, but a lot of other MPs who were maybe very sceptical or believe some of the negative press about what Momentum was like, when they then, you know, saw like hundreds or even thousands of activists turning up to campaign for them, nice people from a range of different backgrounds, you know, not some sect coming in. When they saw that and saw that culture, it's changed them. It's changed a lot of their attitudes and approaches. So yeah, we did campaign everywhere.